Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are and when you're watching. It's actually Sunday evening in California as I record this here. I'm Tori Hoehler. I'm from NASA Ames, and I'm going to talk to you today about the planetary context for life. And I want to begin by flipping our usual perspective. So when we look to the skies, typically we see Saturn as a pale yellow dot about 1 billion miles away from us. Here, if you look under the T in center, we see Earth as a pale blue dot as seen by the Cassini spacecraft from Saturn. And what I want to do in this talk is ask the question, when these worlds are so far away, so distant, and so difficult to access with our observations, what can we say about whether they might be suitable for life or whether, in fact, they are inhabited by life? And when I got to NASA about 22 years ago, the order of the day was follow the water. This is what began to drive solar system exploration for the next couple of decades. And I think the idea behind follow the water is twofold. The first is we understand it to be one of the fundamental requirements of life, an absolute requirement of life as we know it. And the second is we understand quite well the physics and the chemistry of water, and therefore how to look for it. We're good at finding water, even when we can't directly access it. And follow the water has led us to discover liquid water, and it's liquid that's important in these cases, in a number of places. So Mars, for example, if you look at this little inset, this you see as a valley network. So it's an outflow channel of water that comes out of what was originally a crater lake. And it looks not very much different from what I might see in the deserts of the American Southwest as I fly over, or at least as I used to fly over before all of this happened. And on Jupiter's moon Europa, what we see at the surface is an icy shell, in fact, probably tens of kilometers thick, but there's very good evidence that there's a liquid water ocean, another tens to maybe even 100 kilometers thick beneath that. It's not an ocean that we can reach out and touch, but it's an ocean that we can sense quite well, and we know it's there. And quite excitingly, the Cassini mission discovered on Saturn's little moon Enceladus plumes of icy particles and gas emanating from fissures in the moon. And those are believed to originate with a subsurface or a sub-ice ocean, again, tens of kilometers thick beneath tens of kilometers of ice. And the more we've looked, the more we've found. So this is a colleague of mine, Kevin Hand, has a slide that he called Ocean Worlds of the Outer Solar System. So Earth is not the only ocean world anymore. There's Enceladus and Europa, as we talked about. There's potentially Saturn's moon Titan and Neptune's moon Triton, and the Galilean moons Ganymede and Callisto. And others would put still more ocean worlds on this chart. And so really we have something of an embarrassment of riches. We've gone looking for water, and we found it in abundance. It's almost as if we've done an internet search for water in the solar system and come back with so many results that we now need to filter those results to down select a little bit. What do I mean by down select? Well, it's challenging and difficult and costly to go exploring these places. So what can we say beyond follow the water that might help us in prioritizing that search and conducting it in an intelligent and effective way? Well, I think there are two things that we can do. The first is to ask something about the probability that an environment might host life. How likely is it that life is there given a certain set of conditions? And the second is to ask, well, if life is in fact there, how likely is it that we can detect it? How challenging or how easy will it be to detect it? And both of those things might help us to understand where to send spacecraft and how to instrument them to give ourselves the best chance of seeking life in the solar system. So let me talk about the second of those first, detectability. And I think it's important to say here that the presence of life, the mere presence of life, does not guarantee an ability to detect it. So what we need to understand, we need to apply additional filters to understand how we can prioritize where to search for life and what tools to search with. And here I think we can look to the requirements of life as we know it. So life as we know it requires a liquid solvent. In our case, that's water, and that's what's driven much of solar system exploration for the last 2 decades. But it's also built of stuff. It has requirements for specific elements that in our case are carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, as well as a variety of metals. We need energy to assemble all of those components into a functional living thing. Our kind of life actually uses light and chemical energy among a broader range of energy sources that are available. And even for light and chemical energy, we only use a relatively small subset of what's available among those. And so that becomes quite a stringent constraint. And finally, in order for life and the chemistry of life to work properly, it needs a certain range of conditions, a certain range of temperature or pH or salinity or so forth. And all of these things represent filters that we could look for in worlds beyond Earth to place additional constraints beyond simply the one or zero of is water present or not. And when we look at the world around us, it's easy to understand where our water-based perspective comes from, because what we see on the land is a distribution of biomass, a distribution of life that's really driven largely by the availability of water. So if you do the sort of mental experiment of plopping yourself down in the middle of the African continent where you see the deep green there, it's one of the densest, most vibrantly inhabited jungles on Earth. And if you move yourself up by a few hundreds to maybe 1,000 miles or so, you'd find yourself in an environment, the Sahara Desert, that superficially seems largely devoid of life. And that's a very large variation in the abundance of life that's driven primarily by availability of water. But it's not the only thing that controls the distribution of life on Earth. Suppose we went to the oceans where water is present all the time. So here we're looking at a satellite map of sea surface chlorophyll. So chlorophyll is the photosynthetic pigment that plants and microscopic photosynthetic organisms have. And what you see in the color scale from the deep purple color to the bright red color is about 2,000-fold variation in how much photosynthetic life is present in the surface of the oceans. And that variation of a couple thousand-fold is driven by the availability of nutrients, so largely nitrogen and phosphorus and sometimes iron. Those are things that the biologists call nutrients. It's what you might call fertilizer that you put on the plants at home to make them grow. So this is a second aspect of biological requirement that drives 1,000-fold variation in the abundance of life. And if you could go beneath the surface of the oceans, down so deep that light is no longer present, in fact, all the way down into the sediments of the ocean bottom, and ask how much life is present there. A colleague of mine has done that, in fact. He's done it all over the world, and he's gone tens to even hundreds of meters deep in the sediment. And what you see here is plotted the number of cells, the number of microbial cells that he was able to count. And they're plotted in log scale, meaning each jump in increment from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 and so on represents a 10-fold jump. So from the most abundantly inhabited sediments to the least abundantly inhabited is about a 10 million-fold variation in the amount of life that's there. And that variation is driven by the availability of energy. So now we have at least 3 sets of constraints. We have water, we have nutrients, and we have energy, all of which drive a continuum of life, not just 1 or 0, but sparse to abundant, a little to a lot. And those are things that we could leverage to advantage. If we could actually see them on other worlds, we might have a sense of how possible life is. And in fact, that's beginning to happen. So here's Enceladus again, the moon of Saturn. That's the Cassini spacecraft pictured in the bottom, not an actual photo, but an artist's conception. And that spacecraft, despite never going with the purpose of investigating the oceans of Enceladus, because in fact it wasn't known that Enceladus had an ocean at that point, has done a remarkable job. The science team associated with Cassini has done a remarkable job in checking off some of the boxes of habitability. So in fact, it knows, or it's been determined, that there's a liquid water ocean. But not only that, it's been found that there's carbon dioxide and hydrogen that can combine, and we have organisms on Earth called methanogens that can do this, to release energy. We know something about the conditions there, a little bit about the temperature, even the pH and the salinity of the ocean, which I think is absolutely remarkable. And we've been able to directly sample and assess the abundance of carbon and hydrogen and nitrogen, oxygen, and sulfur. And the one thing that we haven't seen there yet is phosphorus, which I put in red. So it's not a complete picture. Phosphorus would actually be very challenging to see, even if Cassini had looked in our own oceans, where there remains enough to drive an abundance of life. But I think it's important to say these are necessarily snapshots. They're very challenging measurements to make. They give us a picture of what the ocean looks like now, but I think the next important step is to ask how much through time. It matters to say what the flux is, how much energy is flowing through the system through time, how many nutrients through time. And we can do a simple thought experiment looking at our own Earth. So Earth is the only place where sunlight flows directly into liquid water. And by that simple virtue, we can have a photosynthetic biosphere that has access to the abundant energy of the sun. If we lacked that access to the sun, we'd be limited to the planet's own chemical energy. And that's about 1 million times less or so than what our biosphere has. So our picture that we have in our heads when we look around us of what an inhabitable world looks like differs dramatically, I think, from what might be possible on other worlds. And that's something that we would very much need to take into account. The ability to support abundant life, the ability of that life to synthesize molecules that then become evidence of that life, is very much diminished when you diminish the energy supply. And these are things that we need to take into account when we strategize taking the next steps in the exploration of the solar system. But what about this second filter of probability? By probability, I mean, how commonly does life emerge when the conditions are right? And what do we mean by conditions are right? Does that mean conditions that are very much like they were on the beginning of Earth when life emerged here? Or does it mean right in some different way, right for some other organism? Are there conditions that are more right than others? Maybe things could be better than they were at the beginning of life on Earth, maybe much worse. And so these, I think, are largely unknown questions, but it's what brings us back to the purpose of this session overall. It's why we're having a talk about solar system exploration in a session that's about the origin of life. Because really, it's the research into that origin of life that helps to inform our sense of this probability. And here I want to go back to the little caveat that I made earlier, that everything we know, everything that we pursue in the way we look at habitability in the solar system is based on life as we know it. And that's necessary. It's important to be concrete in the way that we think about life and life's requirements. But it matters in the context of origin of life to say that modern life is an extraordinary machine. Even the simplest cells that you see represented on the right-hand side of the screen are extraordinary machines that can process information with error rates of 1 part in 10 billion, that can separate themselves from the outside world and maintain the internal environment under different conditions than the external environment, that can synthesize complex machines that catalyze chemistry millions of times faster than would otherwise happen. And that means that our life as we know it can thrive in conditions that would be intolerable to its naked biochemistry, meaning the molecules that comprise that stuff, exclusive of life's ability to protect them. And I think that probably also extends to the origin of life. It's likely, in my opinion, that the origin of life requires a narrower set of conditions than is possible for supporting the life that we know now. I think it's also important to say that modern life, because of this complex machinery it creates, can synthesize a lot of what it needs in-house within the cell. It can take simple component parts and turn them into the more complex molecules that life needs. And in that respect, it may have much less dependence on environment or environmental diversity, if you want to think of it that way, than was necessary at the origin of life. So if life requires a diversity of components, it may require a diversity of environmental settings in which to produce and synthesize those components. That doesn't matter as much now when life has the ability to do so much for itself and can occupy a broader range of niches. On the other side of the coin, I think that our life is quite possibly locked into a subset of all of the chemistries and resources that could possibly support life overall. And maybe that also extends to life's origin, even the origin of our own life. Maybe the requirements as we think of them now, very specific requirements for chemical energy or light energy, or particular elemental requirements, were somewhat relaxed at the origin of life. Maybe other sources of energy would do, or maybe one element could stand in for another. And it's simply that life has picked up a certain thread and run with it. So it's these two counter-opposing things, the possibility, I think, that the conditions that foster the origin of life, or the need for diversity in environments at the origin of life, may be different than what we see as represented in our modern extant life. But also what we see represented in our extant life might represent a subset of all that's possible. And here I want to come back to the overall purpose of this talk, which is to discuss a possible convergence among sciences. So you would think of planetary sciences and astronomy as being quite disparate from life sciences and microbiology and origin of life research. But I really think they're mutually informative. By looking at the planets in our solar system and even beyond our solar system, we get a sense of the true diversity of environments that might create context for life to originate and proliferate. And by thinking about our own origins and how they are placed in the context of life's own environments, we can look beyond Earth to our solar system and beyond and ask whether life might in fact be possible, and we have a chance to detect it. And so sitting in between these two and feeding back and forth is the science of geochemistry and perhaps even biogeochemistry, that it's the planet itself that gives context to the life that lives there, but the life that transforms the planet. And so this, I think, is what allows this session to happen in the context of the Goldschmidt Conference, and what hopefully I think in the future will unite the sciences of life science and planetary science. And so in closing, I just want to thank you so much for your time and attention, and I'll stop sharing. I hope that you'll all join us for the discussion section, the panel discussion that has to do with our Origin of Life session. Thank you all so much.